And now, my pleasure to introduce, no, I'm standing in front of you, Baptiste Le Bihan.
Thank you, Karen. All right, so what I want to do today is to talk about space-time emergence, and I would like to explore the idea that space-time emergence might be functional realization. So I will do that by giving a metaphysical look at what's going on, and I will have a look at the philosophy of mind literature. Like Eleanor, I agree that it's a mess, this literature, but still I think it's possible to find useful distinctions there that may be useful to get a better understanding of what space-time functionalism is or could be. So let me put some context. So in contemporary physics, it seems that many theories entail that space or space-time emerges from a structure in which interesting features of space and time are missing. So this is so in many approaches to quantum gravity, for instance, in loop quantum gravity and string theory, but also in a particular approach to quantum mechanics, configuration space realism. So a general problem is this: what is this relation of emergence? What sort of ontological picture follows from space-time emergence? And there is, yes, could we think of space-time emergence as functional realization? And so here I use the neutral word of emergence, because I think that when philosophers of physics use the word emergence, or the expressions emergence of space-time, it's more the name of a problem. They don't commit to a particular philosophical notions of emergence as we find it in the philosophical literature. So here are two claims I will defend. So maybe they won't be very clear right now, but I hope at the end of the talks it will be clear. So space-time functionalism does not solve the hard problem of space-time emergence, just as functionalism about the mind does not solve the hard problem of consciousness. So here maybe it's not very clear what I mean by hard problem, but as I said, it will be clearer later. And here is the second claim: space-time functionalism comes in many versions, which trigger different answers to the hard problem of space-time emergence. So here I give you two examples of potential emergence of space-time from something which is not spatial-temporal. So first example is in string theory. It seems that a 4-dimensional space-time emerges from a 10-dimensional structure. Right, so from 10 dimensions, we arrive to 4 dimensions. According to a naive understanding, well, there is no real interesting problem of emergence, because it's just that we don't see the additional dimensions. They are compactified, closed on themselves, and we fail to notice them when we zoom out. But since there are 5 different dual string theories, which are empirically equivalent, so it's what's called duality, it seems that we have a problem. It's not clear how we are going to recover general space-time, general relativity, from these 5 theories. So it's not only that we have to find a more fundamental series thanks to this dual theory, but we also want to recover general space-time. So it's what Nick Huggett discussed in one of his papers. And he says that the classic story about the compactification of unobserved dimensions does not explain away the emergence of GR space-time. So here, let's keep in mind that we have a problem, a conceptual discrepancy between the idea of 5 theories and just one theory, GR space-time. So I don't want to enter into the possible ways to understand duality, but in most of the understanding of duality, we have something weird going on, and it seems that some crucial features of space-time are missing. So here is a second example, loop quantum gravity. So there it's quite well known that on one side we have a discrete structure made of quanta, which is supposed to be fuzzy, and on the other side we have a GR space-time which is continuous, not fuzzy. And we also have what I've called that we may call a structural deviation. Sometimes it happens at large distance in the space-time may be mapped onto relation to adjacency in the fundamental structure. So here I think we have an example of a potential case of space-time emergence. How are we going to explain the conceptual discrepancy between the continuous definite on the one hand and the discrete, fuzzy, and structurally deviant on the other hand? Right, so we have two things which seem to be different. How are we going to relate to them? So faced with what I call the explanatory gap, which is an abstract notion which covers all the potential cases of conceptual discrepancy between a theory of quantum gravity and GR, what are we going to do, right? So we may want to try to narrow the conceptual discrepancy between QG and GR, for instance, by trying to massage a bit of GR to find a version of GR which is closer, which has primitive notions which are closer to the primitive notions of QG. So we try to have a version of general relativity which is a bit less spatial-temporal as usually assumed. We can try to go the other way around. We can try to elaborate a QG approach more in line with the primitive notions of GR. So here I think about people saying that space-time comes first, and that we should try to accept that space-time is there and start with this assumption. We can also try to go both directions and to find a middle way by saying that both GR and QG are partially spatial-temporal. So we try to narrow the explanatory gap by going in both directions. But what I want to discuss now is the possibility that there might be a residual gap, right? That we don't manage to completely reduce the explanatory gap, the cognitive dissonance between the primitive notions of GR and the primitive notions of QG. And so for now, let's call this the ontological problem, how to explain this gap. So now I think there are many options. So a first option is to say, well, it's just a brute fact about the natural world. There is an explanatory gap. We have these two sets of primitive notions, and there is nothing to say about it. But maybe we want to say something and try to formulate an answer, an explanation of why there is a why there is a discrepancy between these sets of notions. So the idea would be to say that the discrepancy is non-primitive. We can say something about it. So we could try to explain it with a mind-independent building relation, like philosophical emergence, functional realization, grounding, composition, or maybe identity. Or we may want to say, well, the discrepancy is not grounded in a mind-independent relation. It's grounded in an illusion. So here the idea is to extend what is called the B theory of time. It's metaphysics literature. So you want to say, in the same way, so the story goes like this. In the philosophy of time, the standard position about the flow of time is that time is not flowing in the world. It's more a projection that we put on top of the world. What we have in the world are temporal relations. And for some reason, we have some kind of cognitive illusion that time is flowing, a phenomenal experience of time passing. So maybe we should have the same kind of approach and include not only the flow of time, but time itself, and even space and space-time, and say that the pole of our experience, of our spatial-temporal experience, is an illusion. So I think we have these different approaches here. And what interests me here is that we have roughly three big ontological pictures of what's going on. So first, we have the derivative space-time view, according to which GR space-time exists. It's derivatively real in the framework of an ontologically layered, namely an anti-reductionist picture of the world. So you have layers of reality. You have the spatial-temporal derivative layer. and you have the more fundamental non-spatial temporal layer. The second option is to go reductionist and to say, well, GR spacetime exists, but somehow it's identical with parts of the fundamental structure, maybe not with the whole structure, but with some parts of it, maybe some properties of it. And the decomposition of the fundamental structure into GR spacetime results then in spatial temporal feature. And finally, I think there is a third metaphysical option, which is eliminativism about spacetime. According to this approach, spacetime does not exist at all, and it merely arises because of mathematical limitations and procedures. So it will be more linked to a mathematical artifact. But there will not be space-time, properly speaking, in the world. All right, so what I will do now is try to relate this ontological problem with some quotes by Vincent and Chris in the last paper called Space-Time is as Space-Time Does. So what they do in that paper is that they try to use, sorry, they use.
Maybe we just try.
I will say I'm quite confused about the problem of empirical incoherence, so my bad. So they want to use space-time functionalism as a strategy to solve the problem of empirical incoherence, which is a distinct problem. So let me briefly remind you about what it is. Vincent talked about it this morning. Measurements and observations, which are evidence for a particular physical theory, happen somewhere, somewhen. But how could it be so if there is no space-time? Do we have a theory that says that its evidential claims are deeply false? Right? So at least we have a tension about if we have a theory which says that its evidence are not true. But the thing is, I'm not really worried about this, this particular issue of empirical incoherence. In particular, I agree with Elissa Ney when she says that a theory of confirmation should not impose a priori constraint on the ontological nature of evidence. So perhaps we wrongly believe that our evidence is localized in space and time or in space-time. But maybe it's not transparent. We don't know exactly what the ontological status of our evidence is at the end of the day. So I don't really think that there is a hard problem here. So what's the exact relation between the problem of empirical incoherence and the ontological problem? Well, I'm not sure. For me, it's still quite complicated. It seems to me that when people address the problem of empirical coherence, they appeal to some particular claims that would relate to the ontological problem, and that particular solutions to the problem of empirical incoherence entail particular solutions to the ontological problem, and vice versa. But my project today is to clarify the ontological problem and to show that functionalism does not help there. So I will not speak again about space-time functionalism, but I wanted to make this clear because I will refer to some quotes by Vincent and Chris about what I call the ontological problem. It's not the main part of their essay, but still they say some interesting things there that I want to discuss. Okay, so what do they say on that? So here is the first quote. One central intuition we investigate is that space-time need not be fully recovered in some strong ontological sense in order to provide the grounds for empirical evidence and everyday experience, but only certain functionally relevant features. Here is a second quote. We will investigate to what extent a functionalist perspectives allows us to bridge the metaphysical gap between the structures postulated by these theories and smooth classical space-time as we find it in GR. Here are third quotes, so there will be 4 quotes. don't worry. Whether one ultimately wishes to be a realist or an eliminativist about space-time is orthogonal to our concern here. And finally, from a functionalist point of view, nothing remains beyond showing how the fundamental degrees of freedom can collectively behave such as they appear spatio-temporal and macroscopic scales in all relevant and empirically testable ways. This turns out to be a hard task in quantum gravity. Functionalism can be seen as the assertion that once this task is completed, no unfinished business lingers on. Using a terminology from philosophy of mind, functionalism will then amount to the denial that there is a hard problem beyond the easy problem of the emergence of space-time. So I think there is a tension here in these quotes, because there is a shift from the claim that functionalism is orthogonal to the hard problem to the claim that functionalism solves or dissolves the hard problem. So what I want to do now is to analyze and aim at solving this tension by proposing different interpretations of this series of quotes. So as we will see, I will propose 3 or 4 interpretations of how to understand these quotes. And so in order to do so, I will focus first on the hard problem of consciousness and the hard problem of space-time. And then I will move on to the mind functionalism and then space-time functionalism. All right, so let's start with a quote from David Chalmers about the hard problem of consciousness. It's from a recent manuscript called The Meta Problem of Consciousness. So he writes, the hard problem contrasts with the easy problems of explaining various behavioral functions such as learning, memory, perceptual integration, and verbal report. The easy problems are easy because we have a standard paradigm for explaining them. To explain a behavioral function, we just need to find an appropriate neural or computational mechanism that performs that function. We know how to do this, at least in principle. In practice, the cognitive science have been making steady progress on the easy problems. So the easy problems, basically, we want to find systematic correlations between physical or neurobiological states on one side and mental states. And we want to explain further these correlations in functional terms. So here I don't want to, because one may ask what is a function. Some people have talked about this today. In the philosophy of mind literature, functions have been linked to causal roles, to teleological biological functions, and to mathematical functions. So even in the philosophy of mind, we have different trends, different ways to think of functionalism, but I won't discuss this here. I will just use a neutral notion of functional role. And so the hard problem then is to analyze ontologically the relation between physical states and mental states. And there we have a few options: dualism on identity theory between the mental and physical states, or we could be eliminativist about mental states and say, well, there are no mental states, there are just physical states. So in philosophy of mind, then, there is this famous question about qualia. Is there still something to be explained if you have functionalized everything? So you explain all the mental states in functional terms. It seems that there is still something more to be explained. It's a classical objection, right? So there in the recent paper, Chalmers called let's admit that you're an eliminativist. You believe that the mind is not real. There are no qualia. You still have another problem, right? If you solve the hard problem by saying that that mental states are not real, then you will have what he calls the meta problem, which is to explain why we why we produce wrong reports, why we say that we experience something peculiar, particular about what it is like to feel or experience, for instance, redness. So there is something tricky here. It's a Pandora box. How are we going to deal with qualia and the philosophy of mind? But I want to say this right now because I will compare this issue with the equivalent with space-time functionalism. All right, so let's move on to the case of space-time emergence. Here again, I think it's possible to distinguish between easy and hard problems. Right? So the easy problem will be to derive spatial-temporal theories from the non-spatial temporal theory with mathematical tools. So basically to derive GR from one particular theory of quantum gravity. So of course it's a bit funny to call it the easy problems. It's one of the main tasks of quantum gravity. And it's not easy at all, but it's just to keep the analogy with the philosophy of mind. And then we have the hard problem, which is basically what I introduced as the ontological problem. Should we go dualist, reductionist, or eliminativist? What should we do with the spatial temporal states or spatial temporal properties? Should we try to eliminate them, or should we accept that they are real, or should we try to reduce them to more fundamental building blocks described by QG? So what I want to argue for now is that a broad functionalist strategy does not solve the hard problem, contrary to what has been suggested by Vincent and Chris, because there are many sorts of functionalism, and they lead to different alternative solutions to the hard problem. But before doing so, I would like to address an objection which has been voiced by Eleanor Knox, and Vincent and Chris discuss this objection in the draft I'm referring to. And the objection is like this: well, there is no analogy between what it is like to experience red and what it is like to be space or time or space-time. So we don't really have a hard problem with space-time. We should not care about that. But here I want to push back a bit and say, well, I agree on something. First, I agree that the phenomenal dissonance is not of the same kind, because first, in the case of space-time, it's grounded in our intuitions about concepts to be found in the two theories, not in our phenomenal experience, in our introspection. So it does not have the same source. And second, it's potentially weaker than the conceptual discrepancy between physical and mental concepts, or between our experience of redness and our concept of the physical. So I agree that there are interesting and important differences. But even if the conceptual discrepancy is weaker in the case of space-time realization, space-time emergence, and even if it has a different source, well, there is still an explanatory gap to account for, right? It's where we started from. So I'm really happy if I'm becoming the strawman of Eleanor, really thinking that there is a genuine explanatory gap here. But I mean, I want more. If you want to argue that there is no explanatory gap with space-time emergence, it's not enough to say that it's weaker than the explanatory gap in the philosophy of mind, or that it has a different source. I think there is something more to be said to explain why there is no explanatory gap. All right, so now I want to turn to my third part, which is about mind functionalism and space-time functionalism. And what I will do basically is to distinguish between different kinds of functionalism. I will show that each kind of functionalism leads to a different approach to the ontological problem. So let's start with this quote from von Gulik. According to what one might call analytical functionalism, mental concepts can be analyzed in purely functional terms. That is, the meanings of such concepts can be explicated in terms of conditions that can themselves be specified using only functional concepts. In contrast with ontological functionalists, who assert identities or reductions among real-world items, such as properties, Analytical functionalists assert an identity or reduction among our ways of describing or thinking about the world. So here we have a distinction between analytic functionalism and ontological functionalism. So analytic functionalism is about mental predicates. So here we are talking about the language. When ontological functionalism is about mental properties, the mind, right? And if we want to say a bit more about if we want to describe a bit more analytic functionalism, it seems that since it's about the language, it does not say anything about the hard problem. In fact, it does not say anything on the relation between functions or functional roles and mental properties. It's only about the relation between functional roles and mental predicates. So it's about the language. So for instance, if you are an analytic functionalist, you may have different approaches to the ontology. You can say different things about what's over there in the world. You could be, for instance, like Daniel Dennett, an eliminativist functionalist, and say that, well, there are no mental states, but still we can use analytic functionalism as a tool to explain why the notion of mental states is relevant or useful. So as von Gulik says, they accept the importance of holistic interdependence in analyzing mental state concepts, but nonetheless regard truth makers for mental attributions as solely facts about actual and counterfactual behavior. So here it's a form of eliminativist functionalism, which is very close to logical behaviorism. But then, from this form of analytic functionalism, one may want to move to a more ontological claim, and this ontological claim does not have to be eliminativism about mental states. In fact, we have various options. So first we have occupant functionalism, which is also called realizer functionalism. And this form of functionalism is in the spirit of the original type identity theory, according to which mental types are identical with physical types. And here, functionalism should be regarded as a tool to defend the type identity theory, or at least to defend an identity theory. And the idea is that, well, although we discover empirically that pain is identical with a particular neurological state, still we have a form of analytic functionalism at the linguistic level, at the level of the theory. So as von Gulik says here, the role associated with a given mental kind serves as a means to secure reference to the relevant property, but it does not typically give the identity or essence of that property, which must instead be discovered through empirical investigation. All right, so now here is another ontological functionalism, maybe the most famous form. It's role functionalism. According to it, each mental property is identified with the property of playing a particular role. Right? So von Gulik again, the properties of being pain and of playing the pain role are regarded as one and the same property. If one thinks instead in terms of properties had by whole persons, such as that of being in pain, the role functionalist will identify such mental properties with the property of being in some state which plays a relevant role. Right, so here it's more second order kind of functionalism. So here is my take on the useful classification of mind functionalism, which we could use in the, to analyze space-time emergence. So first we have analytic functionalism, right? Mental predicates are analyzed partially or totally in functional terms. And then we may move to three different sorts of functionalism. Occupant functionalism, which is a conjunction of analytic functionalism plus a commitment to identity theory. Eliminativist functionalism, which is a conjunction of analytic functionalism plus eliminativism. And role functionalism, which is not based on analytic functionalism, but which takes very seriously the idea of functional role and reifies the roles, and thinks that, well, roles are part of the ontological furniture in the world. And so role functionalism entails a form of property dualism in some sense, because I will say more about this later, but because the realizers and the roles realized by these realizers have different modal properties, so they cannot be identified. So now let's move on to what's the time?
10 minutes.
Okay, great. So let's move on to space-time functionalism. So analytic functionalism is the view that the concept of space-time, or the predicate of space-time, or predicates associated with space-time, are described by functional roles in some theory. So at first glance, it seems to me that it would be the kind of functionalism that Elena Knox defends about GR. We could be an ontological functionalist and say that, well, it's more than a purely analytic form of, it's not only about the language, it's about the ontology. And here we have the claim that there is a relation between ontological contra theoretical roles and realizers. And this relation might be identity, realization, or elimination. But the point is that you appeal to some relation about what's going on in the world. It's not only, you're not talking about the language only anymore. So the first option is role functionalism. According to it, space-time is a mind-independent structure described by GR, realized by another more fundamental structure described by QG. And so, as I said here, roles are numerically distinct from realizer since they don't share the same modal properties. So you can think here about multi-realizability. So basically that GR spacetime could be instantiated or realized by different fundamental structures, just like one software can be run by different hardwares. So here you have really the idea that you have a numerical distinction between GR spacetime and the more fundamental structure. So you have a form of property dualism, or maybe not property dualism, but you have something which looks like dualism. Second option is occupant functionalism. In this case, we may refer to the realizers, the building blocks of the structure described by QG, as linguistic roles in GR. And here the identity is that here's the idea is that spatial-temporal entities are identical with non-spatial-temporal entities. So what does it mean? It seems to be a bit contradictory, but what it means is that, in fact, we are only referring to one thing in both GR and QG, but we don't refer to this thing with the same concepts. And your concept may have different connotations, and they are not transparent, right? They don't deliver the nature of what they refer to. So here we have kind of analytic functionalism plus identity theory. And finally, maybe we could also think of a kind of eliminativist functionalism, according to which we do not refer to anything with GR. And the functionalist machinery works for some reason, which is not the effectiveness of functional roles in GR. So here we will have analytic functionalism plus eliminativism about GR spacetime. All right, so I'm not saying that all of these positions are good or well motivated, but I think at least we should distinguish between them in order to assess them. All right, so last quote from Vincent and Chris, just to come back to their essay. Although one may read our article as an expression of role functionalism, we remain uncommitted between role functionalism and occupant functionalism. So in fact, you talk about realizer functionalism, but here I identify realizer functionalism with occupant functionalism. In fact, we wish to leave open the possibility of resisting the dichotomy. And here is the first point. So I think fair enough, but I want to go a bit further. If world functionalism is the correct interpretation of their approach, then they are committed to the derivative space-time view. And it's not orthogonal to the hard problem. Their view have a particular entail. It entails a particular answer to the hard problem. Secondly, if they resist the dichotomy, then they are not solving or dissolving the hard problem of space-time emergence because they will only appeal to analytic functionalism. Because I think one particular interpretation is that you just use analytic functionalism and that's it. You don't say anything more. But if that's the case, then there are, again, two options. First, you could say, well, we want to be neutral. We don't have any ontological commitment. Fair enough, but then it's just that you are not considering the hard problem of space-time emergence. You are not saying anything about it. Or here is another interpretation. Maybe there is no dichotomy because we should not distinguish between these various kinds of ontological functionalism. But then I want to ask why. If that's what you want to do, then there is an argumentative gap in the justification of the claim that there is no hard problem. There is something more to be explained. And in fact, I think another option would be to be eliminativist. You could say, well, we want to defend, to use analytic functionalism as a tool. And since GR is not a fundamental theory, we don't take it seriously. So we are eliminativist about GR space-time. But I just want to show that there are different ontological interpretations of what's going on, and there are different ontological interpretations of what's going on if you analyze space-time emergence as being space-time functional realization. So to conclude, I think that a functional treatment of space-time emergence does not solve the hard problem because it's consistent with at least 4 distinct functionalist views. And this argumentative issue is orthogonal to Lam and Wüthrich's claim that functionalism solves the problem of empirical incoherence. On this point, I have nothing to say. And perhaps, also something I want to say, perhaps the ontological problem is not empirical enough to be interesting, right? My suspicion is that most philosophers of physics, they don't care about the ontological problem. And the reason why they don't care is that it's not related to the empirical world. There is no real empirical way to solve the matter, to settle the issue. So perhaps we should just remain silent on the issue and not addressing the issue. But still, if that's the motivation for not taking into account the hard problem of space-time, I think that it's not because functionalism explains or make the issue go away. It's really because we have separate motivation for not taking seriously this issue or for not caring about it. But it's not functionalism which solves or dissolves the hard problem of space-time emergence. Right, thank you.
Great. Vincent?
Thank you, Baptiste, for the talk. The question, do we really say that our strategy is orthogonal to the hard problem?
Yeah.
I think then this might be somewhat misleading formulation because.
So you don't say it like you don't say it explicitly. What you say is that yes. So I take this to be equivalent to that because you say that you wish to be, you don't care about whether we should be realist or eliminativist.
This is why you're criticizing me, I think.
Yeah. I think we might have something else in mind there, but
okay.
I see now the reading that you have. But no, my question is, we define the hard problem as should we go for reductionism, eliminativism, this kind of questions being constitutive of the hard problem. Is that?
Yes, that's correct.
Then it's a reductionist strategy. End of the story. In this sense, it's solved the hard problem. No, it's plain the plain naive reading of the functional strategy. It's a functional. It's a strategy for functionally reducing classical smooth GR space-time to the level below.
Mm-hmm. So
whether it fully works or not, is another. How it the details and so on. It's another issue. But to answer your question is
okay. So
we should go for reductionism.
Okay. So you mean that for you it's obvious that what the kind of functionalism that you want to defend is what I've called occupant functionalism?
I'm not sure about
an identity theory, reductive kind of functionalism.
I think it's a reductive project, normally, yes. But then the further more metaphysical distinctions, that's a footnote where we want to not to commit ourselves. I'm not sure about the translation of these conceptions in the space-time context. But to answer the broad question about whether it's a reductive project, yes, it is.
Okay, but fair enough. But if you say this, then I take you to defend a particular kind of functionalism, which is occupant functionalism, and you don't really have multi-realizability in this case, which might be a good thing in the case of space-time functionalism.
Okay.
But then I will take you to react to what I said as, well, of course we defend this particular sort of functionalism, and it's not role functionalism, it's occupant functionalism.
Yeah, okay, I have to think about the more metaphysical subtleties there, but still I think, because I took you, beyond these details, I took one of your arguments to be, points to be that with the functionalist strategy we are advocating in this paper, we are not solving the hard problem. Mm-hmm. Or we are not.
Yeah, I think you are not, because in order to solve the hard problem, you have to take position on
you have to say something more.
You have to say something more. You have to say whether you defend occupant functionalism or role functionalism, and how you define exactly your functionalism.
Okay, so for you it's not enough us just saying that we advocate a kind of functional reduction of smooth space-time to something else, and then the more metaphysical subtleties we leave them open.
Yes, I mean, for me, what you wrote is consistent with several metaphysical interpretations, and perhaps it's what you show, or you could say that since you don't really care about the metaphysical subtleties, you don't engage with this issue. But instead, I hope that this classification may help you to explain exactly what you don't commit to exactly.
Okay. And just another very small comment. You talk about the role of space-time as a whole. We are a bit more cautious than that in the sense that first we are more interested to recover certain localized, if you want, space-time or roles of space-time features, and then specifically the ones which are directly relevant for making sense of empirical data, rather than recovering or trying to define the role of space-time as a whole.
Fair enough. I mean, I was thinking about the metaphysical subtleties, but not necessarily about these physical subtleties.
Thanks.
Do you want to add to this?
Yes, please, if I may. So thank you very much. This is helpful. Maybe I can explain a little bit what our project is and what we mean by the various quotes, so that they appear a little bit less inconsistent, perhaps. And maybe at the end, what it boils down to is that we have a slightly different understanding of what the hard problem is. And maybe we're wrong about that, but let me explain. So I think Vincent has already said that it's ultimately some kind of reductionist program. You're trying to understand what are the aspects and features of space-time that we should care about, which are relevant for empirical confirmation, for all sorts of other theoretical purposes, perhaps, whatever. But what are the important features of that? And how could we get them from some more fundamental theory in quantum gravity? How could we reduce these features and things effectively to something in the more fundamental structures or combinations of the more fundamental entities, or something like that. That is definitely the program. It's a bit like trying to understand, how come we have this table when we know that, that this is really sort of built up from other stuff in interesting ways. So let's analyze the tabularity of this thing. And we do that, and we analyze the constitution, and we come to the conclusion, oh, there are sort of elementary particles, they combine in such and such ways. Oh, here's how, there's this table that has the solidity, the form, the color, etc., all the sort of properties we get. Okay? Now, what we are not interested in, at least that's what I had in mind when I wrote this, is whether then, once you successfully concluded a project like that, whether then you say, oh, so I just say there's the elementary particles and no tables, or whether the tables are just the elementary particles, or whether you think the table is something over and above. That's sort of the metaphysical debate we're not interested in pursuing. That's what we're trying to put away here in a quote like that. We're really interested in understanding that relationship and to solve that reductive problem somehow. Now, when we then say that we think our attitude sidesteps or avoids or dissolves the hard problem, we don't mean to say that it sort of takes a stance or a position in that debate or something like that debate. What we mean to say is that you can show, by pursuing this program, if it's successfully concluded, that the qualia, the friend of qualia, of space-time qualia, has nothing left to complain about. There's sort of no remaining explanatory task to be fulfilled. So that's what so the hard problem is like, once you've understood all the aspects of the easy problem, then there's the big problem of qualia that you have to solve. And we think our attitude and our argument is supposed to show that no, there's nothing left to be done. There's nothing, philosophy of mind be as it may, but in philosophy of space-time, there's nothing that somehow left there to be explained. That's what we mean when we say there's no hard problem left. Does this make a bit more sense?
Yeah, it makes perfectly sense. Actually, I think we could distinguish between the hard problem, as you describe it, namely the friend, satisfying the friend of special temporal qualia by saying, well, you see, we explain everything there is to explain, from another problem of hard problem of space-time, which is what's the solution between the four candidates, between eliminativism, dualism, etc. Because I think even if you say that you explain everything there is to explain, well, still you still have the choice between all these options, and you didn't. You didn't give a reason to believe that you are not entitled to ask this question. I think, although you solve everything there is to solve in one sense, but still you can still ask the question, I think. So,
well, suppose I give you all the answers to the easy problems, and the functional reduction, it's fully there, and then you come to me and ask back, well, but does space-time exist? And you're like, well, I told you everything that's relevant to know about that question. What else do you want to, what? And you say, well, but my question is, which of these four positions or three positions do you take?
Yeah, but then I will. But then I want to
ask why we're not.
Yes, I'm still a bit worried about that, right? Because yes, if you say that we said everything there is to say, it then means that you should not say this, right? You should not distinguish between various sorts of functionalism. And maybe that's a good way to go, but I still want to know why we should not do that. And I think it's what's missing to get a complete story.
So I wonder if I can just turn this around slightly, and I think the burden of proof is going in a funny direction here. Like in the philosophy of mind debate, it's not like the anti-functionalist comes along and just says, there's obviously a hard problem or an explanatory gap. You get Mary, right, coming out of her room. There's these arguments given about what the gap is purported to be, and they all are based on failure. So what I want to get a handle on, so I don't think it's quite fair to say you haven't solved a hard problem unless you have, in mind debate, we'll say things about the hard problem and about the explanatory gaps. I'm trying to get a real handle on what you take that explanatory gap to be, because I think one of the problems is that that's not always entirely clear. One of the things I thought maybe hinted at what you thought the explanatory gap was something I found very surprising. So this thing about some general relativity, you talked about functionalist or dynamical approaches to general relativity, reformulating the theory, as if there was, in the formulation of general relativity, there was some kind of metaphysical viewpoint about space-time. And I think that was very surprising. I mean, I might take general relativity to be committed to a whole bunch of stuff. Like if you are a realist about GR, you should be a realist about metric fields. But it's not like general relativity on its sleeve tells you what kind of ontological category metric field fills. I mean, you just get 100 different answers.
Why do you think I was saying that? I don't get it. Because
you talked about needing to reformulate general relativity to say, take a particular attitude.
I was just taking GR as a theory, as a linguistic entity that you can analyze with functionalist tools. And saying that if you want to move to the ontological domain, then you have to many different directions you can go. But I was not saying that.
So as I say, so what I was thinking was that you seem to think, you talked about the primitive ontology of GR as if that's something that the theory comes with. So I think that
I didn't talk about the primitive ontology of GR, I don't think so.
Well, I mean, there was a slide where you referred to dynamical relativity and functionalism as requiring a reformulation, you use that word, of general relativity. And then at some point you talked about primitive interpretation of GR.
Yeah, so can I try to say what I was willing to say? So the idea was, we have this paper with Niels where we want to try to to show that when we face this conceptual discrepancy between the primitive notions of QG theory and GR, one way to go might be to try to reinterpret or to formulate a bit differently or to think differently of GR. But here I'm not talking about the ontology, I'm talking about the primitive notions, the linguistic notions.
What are the primitive notions of general relativity?
I don't really know, maybe you should ask Niels about that.
I mean, I've worked on GR my whole career, I have no idea what those are. So I think that there's a theory written in mathematical language, and that realist interpretations of it are committed to certain things representing the metric fields. And then there's interpretational debate about what you think take the metric field, what kind of category you take the metric field, something like the metric field to fall under. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I was thinking that taking a functionalist approach to GR was going to do was you have this sort of theory on the table, and yes, sort of symmetry considerations perhaps under determination worries give you some indication of what kinds of things you take ontologically seriously. Mm-hmm. And then there's a second project of, once you've taken some part of mathematics to genuinely represent physical structure, what concept that you can import from elsewhere or from previous theories those physical structures fall under. So that project it's not that GR wears its interpretation on its sleeve. I mean, you just can't get enough agreement between Einstein, between physicists to think that happens. There's something like a bare theory that everyone will assent to. It probably includes something like the commitment to the metric fields. But I think your gap is depending on some idea that there's an interpretation of GR that it automatically comes with that's in contrast to quantum gravity, and it's just that's not a gap that I recognize in the foundations of physics. Yeah. So I think there's a problem with establishing that there's a gap there to be explained in the first place.
Sorry, let me. So, yeah, I guess the dialectic here is that. So you want to find a theory of quantum gravity, and you have GR as a tool, And the idea is that in order, you don't believe that we should care about the ontology of GR, because you don't really care about, at this stage, about what GR is telling you about the world. You just want to find a way to express it in a way which is convenient to be related to your theory of quantum gravity.
So, forgetting about quantum gravity for a moment, I was thinking that there's a project of thinking about which structures you take in a theory to be physical, and you might go about that project in general relativity, and that might be a lot of what philosophers of physics are interested in doing, and you might worry about where you might sort of have whole argument concerns, etc., in there. And then one of the things that I'm trying to advocate for functionalism is that you should perhaps separate that project from the project of working out, once you've done that, which things fall under the space-time concept. Now, of course, if you establish some relationship between GR and a more fundamental theory, you may change your mind about how you wanted to interpret general relativity. But it's not that there's some primitive notions. I mean, it's not like GR. I mean, of course, there are people who think GR is committed to something like a point manifold, but that's not part of general relativity itself. GR is committed to, is written in differential geometry terms, and so, and it's not like pointy manifolds are magically space-timey in some ontological category kind of way. So then you discover that there's general relativity and there's some relationship to a lower theory, and now we can have a talk about whether we should revise whether we think that there's a sense in which we think the ontology of GR genuinely emerges, or whether we should revise it. And I think that's going to be part of the kind of project of spelling out all of these relationships that Chris is talking about. But it's not that it's not that in the absence of all of that detail, there's a gap to be explained. Of course, there's a gap if I've just got GR and I've got theory of quantum gravity and I have no idea what the relationship between this theory and this theory is. But I'm still not seeing what the metaphysical gap is once I think the only way you can establish a metaphysical gap is by thinking that there's some way GR must be interpreted purely in abstract on its own, and that must be maintained in the presence of a kind of deeper understanding of how the physical theory puts together. And I think it just depends on a very, very different conception of what we're trying to do when we interpret theories than I think I have.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I think I don't get it because I'm not really interested at all about how we should interpret GR, leaving aside quantum gravity. It's more like when you experiment that on, for instance, you have one theory which is describe a continuous world, one theory which describes a discrete world. We have the intuition that there is something difficult in the combination of the two. How do we recover continuousness from discreteness? I think there is an explanatory gap. I'm just saying.
Oh, great! That's a great question, but it's not obvious that that's not functional. I mean, the point is you showed that you talk about how you discover continuous. I mean, we talk about this in fluids and things as well. We talk about how we recover continuous descriptions from discrete descriptions, and then functionalist, and there's a whole load of interesting stuff. Do you take a continuum limit? There's lots of interesting questions there. But is there a gap left once someone answers that question?
Then move on. Joanna's got a question.
Okay, it's a similar point. I wanted to say that I see this analogy between the case of philosophy of mind and what you said about loop quantum gravity. Because the second one is connected with the notion of scale. So in the case of philosophy of mind, we say that we have a hard problem because we ascribe to mind some features from one point of view, namely first-person point of view, and we ascribe to the very same object some another features from another point of view, namely third-person point of view, and it seems that these features are inconsistent. It seems to me that this is what hard problem amounts to. But in the case of loop quantum gravity, if someone believes that loop quantum gravity really describes correctly our world, then one cannot say literally that space-time is at the same time discrete and is at the same time continuous, because one should say that the space, okay, maybe not space-time, but one needs to say that it is discrete, and in some approximation it is correctly described by continuous theory. But this notion of continuity, in order to be defined, should refer to very small scales on which, according to quantum gravity, space-time is not continuous anymore. So literally, one cannot say that it is at the same time both continuous and discrete, and this is this analogy with the case of mind.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, I think here you are using the notion of approximation and maybe of limit, and the idea will be, well, the world is both discrete and continuous, but it's a matter of scale. Or other option, the world is discrete, and when we zoom out, we have the wrong impression that it's continuous. But then I will say that what it means, if in the second scenario, is that when you zoom out, when you zoom out, you can use a tool which is just space-time, which is continuous. Still means that the world is discrete, right? So it would be a view in which you are eliminativist about just space-time. It will not be the view that the world is both discrete and continuous, depending on the scale of observation. It's, because it's more like when you are at one scale, you see what's going on, really. And when you zoom out, you are another scale where you don't see what's going on, and you have the false impression that everything is continuous.
But should we say that it is continuous, or maybe it will be sufficient to say that to a certain approximation it is correctly described by continuous theory?
Yeah, but if you say that, I think you are in the eliminativist interpretation, because you are subsuming what you are saying under the clause that it is under a particular approximation that things are like this and like that. So if it's an approximation, it's an approximation. It's not purely factive. You're describing exactly what's going on, I think.
Okay. Hopefully we have coffee arrived and we can continue this there. Sorry, people I couldn't get to, but hopefully you can attack Baptiste in coffee break. So.